Okay, so can I welcome the committee and members of the public to this meeting of the London Assembly Housing Committee. The main item today will be a discussion with invited guests on the current delivery of Housing First homelessness services in London. Members of the public can follow the meeting on the webcast and on Twitter using the hashtags Assembly Housing and Housing First. And please may I remind members, guests and people watching in the audience to turn your phones off or put them on silent. And can I ask if any apologies have been received, please?
Apologies for absence have been received by Assemblymember Boff and Assemblymember.
Thank you. And we have Assemblymember Bacon attending
Just
as a
received
substitute.
Apologies as well.
Oh, okay, great. Okay, so that's okay. We'll work that one out later. Are we quorum?
Yes, we are.
But nobody can leave. Is that correct?
We've got there's 5 members and we need a quorum of 4.
Yes. So we have 5 of us. So somebody can leave one at a time. Just to be clear.
One at a time.
Yes. just to warn you all. Wait for your colleague to come back. Right, item 2 on the agenda is the declaration of interest. Can I ask members to note the list of officers on the report and ask if you have any additional interest to declare? No, thank you. Item 3 is our summary list of actions. Can I ask members to note the outstanding actions arising from previous meetings?
Agreed.
Thank you. Which takes us straight on to today's main item, which is about the current delivery of Housing First homelessness services in London. Can I welcome our 4 guests? We have Mark Taylor, who is the Assistant Director of Services at the Single Homeless Project, which delivers Housing First services to a number of boroughs. We have Stuart Neville, the Chief Executive Officer of SPEAR, which also does a form of Housing First homelessness services in London. We have Hannah Gowsey, who is the Policy and Public Affairs Manager for Crisis, and David Eastwood, who is the Rough Sleeping Lead Manager for Housing and Land in the GLA. Thank you all for coming. Before we start, I wanted to just briefly ask Mark Taylor to give us the definition of Housing First. What are we talking about today in terms of how it differs from other approaches to chronic homelessness services?
All right, thanks. So I'll try and give a reasonable definition as I understand it. So I guess Housing First turns housing-related support on its head a bit. So rather than the traditional approaches, which is to warehouse vulnerable rough sleepers in large hostels and then expect them to engage in support and overcome a number of hurdles to maintain their residency. Housing First begins with the principle, it's a very simple principle, that everyone has a right to a home. And essentially they have a right to their own front door. So rather than housing people within sort of warehouses or large hostels, Housing First clients get their own home, which may be provided through the private rented sector, through social housing or through registered social landlords. And then underpinning that and supporting that is the support, really. So fundamentally the home is the basis on which people can begin their journey of recovery. And traditionally, Housing First is aimed at the most entrenched rough sleeping group. This is the group that it's seen to work most fundamentally for and where it's most cost effective. So alongside the home, then we offer flexible and open-ended support, which again is unusual because most support floating support as we would call it, tends to be time limited. So now the recovery journey is basically determined by the client. So the length of the support, how much support they engage in, is very much a client-centred approach. And effectively we're separating housing and support. So the housing is delivered and the support, whether or not the client engages with the support, the amount of support they get, the amount of engagement, is very much determined by the client. So it's a client-led approach really, and that works much better with a client group who have found themselves outside of the mainstream of supported housing really. We tend to use a strengths-based model.
Okay.
So, Bill, is that enough?
That's quite a lot. We'll come back to you to ask for more details.
Okay,
but essentially what you're saying is that housing is given unconditionally to people and then who have chronic homelessness, possibly multiple problems,
yes,
and support for other problems is provided on top of that.
Yeah, yes, and
rather than
engage with
being
other services, we support the client to link in with drug substance misuse
Yeah.
service mental health.
And that's rather than housing being conditional on engaging in support first, the housing is provided first.
That's right. Yeah.
Right, okay, thank you very much. Cheers. Also to David, David Eastwood, you're the rough sleeping lead manager at the GLA. What responsibilities does the Mayor have for rough sleeping, just as his, rather than going into detail about your work, what's his sort of statutory responsibilities here? What does he have to do?
It doesn't have any statutory duty,
Okay.
but in terms of duties, so the Mayor has kind of two functions. One is kind of providing the strategic direction, which he does through No Night Sleeping Rough Task Force, and the other one is through commissioning services. So we commission Pan-London services where it makes sense to commission Pan-London services, such as No Second Night Out or Chain, and we also provide services to fill the gaps where boroughs don't commission their own services, so such as London Street Rescue, where we provide outreach in the 13 boroughs who don't commission their own outreach services. So he has kind of two main functions, one strategic and one more the operational services.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, we'll move on to our questions now. I'll start by asking about the need for this, the demand for this, and this is a question to Hannah first of all. We know there are issues with counting rough sleepers, with knowing the scale of the problem. Do we know how many Londoners there are in need of help with chronic homelessness?
Yeah, so just to set the scene in terms of the numbers of people in London who are experiencing the very worst forms of homelessness, we've recently commissioned Heriot-Watt University to undertake a piece that looks at people who are sleeping rough, who are sleeping in cars, tents and on public transport, people who are living in unsuitable forms of temporary accommodation, so that could be hostels, but also people who are sofa surfing, so people who are staying with strangers from night to night, they don't have any certainty about where they'll be going from there. So what we found was that in 2016, there were around 60,000 people living in London who were experiencing these worst forms of homelessness. We also found that if we sort of project forward into the future, that by 2026, that number is projected to rise to around 90,000 people if there's no significant change to government policy. Last year, we published a plan to end homelessness, and as part of that plan, we commissioned Imogen Blood Associates to look at the demand for housing first across the UK or in Great Britain, and we found that there's a huge mismatch between demand and the provision of Housing First services. So there are around 2,300 people we've estimated in London that would be eligible for a Housing First place, and that's based on their current experience of homelessness, so how long they've experienced homelessness for, but also based on the fact that they have multiple support needs. What we know from that research is that there are currently only around 84 people in London who are being supported by projects, so there's a huge gap in terms of provision at the moment for people.
That seems absolutely huge. So you're saying of the 60,000 people who are experiencing the worst kinds of homelessness, there are 2,300 people with long-term experience of this kind of homelessness,
Yes.
plus other support needs.
Yes.
And what are those other support needs?
So in terms of support needs, we're looking at people who have a history of offending behaviour, who have mental and physical health problems, but also addiction issues in terms of alcohol and drugs. It is worth saying that that 2,300 number is a fairly conservative estimate, so it only estimates the number of people who are in need of Housing First right now. What it doesn't do is calculate future needs, so it may be that we have people leaving the care system or the prison system who would also be eligible for a Housing First offer, but what that number does is just calculate the current need provision for Housing First.
So in terms of London, David, how are you looking at this problem? Are you taking note of Crisis's figures and making plans? Are you commissioning any further research at a London level? Obviously it's great that Crisis did this, but if it's the Mayor's responsibility, should we be in the GLA looking at this more closely?
And we are. I mean, I think there, as Hannah said, there's different ways of cutting numbers and looking at the numbers. So you can look at numbers and work out about 3,000. You could look at Chain. So obviously we commissioned Chain. We know there were about 7,500 rough sleepers last year. Of that group, if you take the flow out, which is around 4,000, you end up with about 3,000 individuals who are kind of your stock and returner numbers, who you could say could benefit from a Housing First or a housing-led approach. Obviously at the moment we have some very good hostels that work, they're commissioned by local authorities, so the Mayor doesn't have any powers in relation, or doesn't get involved in relation to the commissioning of hostels. That's very much from the borough level. I think if you're looking at Housing First and you're looking at that very much step change in terms of in relation to an approach, it is very much a different approach to what is currently offered in relation to across the board. You need to look at it at scale, you need to look at the feasibility about putting money all in one pot and then working out how to divide it best, which is very difficult when the Mayor only has limited powers in this area and limited funding in this area. So I think we are in conversations with Crisis and with MHCLG about looking at a London-only feasibility study in relation to Housing First, in relation to what scale we will need to actually step up to be able to do those changes and make the changes at the scale that's needed to mean that Housing First is a step change approach.
We'll get more onto what the Mayor's doing much later on in the meeting. Have you been looking at Manchester? Because we've seen reports that Manchester set up a Housing First service.
Yes.
And that the count of rough sleepers in Manchester was estimated at 278, and that's everybody, not just the long-term ones, the short-term ones as well. And then they had 500 referrals, over 500 referrals in their first year. So are you concerned that estimates of need might be too low, that once this is set up, the demand might outstrip what's being provided?
Not necessarily. I think we're very lucky in London to have chain, so we actually know more detailed information than Manchester do.
And this is calculated differently than
Manchester
the
don't
census.
have. Manchester different to accounts. Account obviously is a one-off snapshot where people go out. In London, we have the chain where all outreach workers record everyone who has seen rough sleeping, provide an intervention in terms of that. So we know across the entire year everyone who has seen rough sleeping by an outreach worker in London. Manchester do not have that same level of information. So actually we know more in terms of what client groups are there. We know, like I say, that 4,000 people are only seen rough sleeping once. Interventions are provided. If you know people do not, those people don't return back to rough sleeping. They don't have that level of information in Manchester. So we have more information, so we have better data. So I think we know more of what are the needs for that group. We know the support needs of everyone who's on the streets, so we know more information than Manchester do. In terms of will demand outstrip supply, I think that depends on what model you use of Housing First. It depends how, basically, the cohort that you choose. We can choose the cohort in London, which we did before, in relation to the pilot we did back in 2011, that we did in relation to Housing First, where we piloted the approach from the GLA and piloted a pan-London approach to try and test the water, see if it could work, in the hope that boroughs themselves would then actually end up implementing the model, which a number of boroughs did, such as Camden, in terms of taking that forward. So we had an approach in terms of to try and test the market back in 2011. I think now we're looking at what more can we do. And yes, it is an approach that has got some evidence of scale. Manchester were very lucky to get funding from central government. That was not an open bidding process in relation to how Manchester and Liverpool and the other areas got the money. That was something that the government just went to those areas and suggested they would do Housing First. We were rather disappointed that it wasn't an open bidding process and that we weren't allowed to bid, because we would have been putting forward that. We did publish the Mayor's rough sleeping plan of action in June last year, which had Housing First as one of the areas that we'd like to develop. So the Mayor is very much interested in taking this forward, but we need to do this at scale for it to actually work.
Thank you. Hannah, did you have any further comment on that?
Yeah, I guess just in terms of the cohort in Manchester and why there's a bit of a mismatch between the numbers of people who are sleeping rough and the numbers of people who will be going into Housing First, it's worth saying that this isn't just an intervention for people who are rough sleeping, this is also an intervention for people who are using the current hostel system. So what we found is that there is a number of people who kind of cycle around that hostel system, and that current homelessness services are not working effectively in terms of ending their homelessness. The other thing that I wanted to say in terms of meeting demand and the fact that Housing First could potentially be a service that could become flooded in terms of demand is that it needs to be situated within a broader homelessness strategy, which also focuses on prevention. So we're kind of turning the taps off in terms of the people that do go on to experience chronic homelessness, but also that we need a wider housing-led approach. So if we have a system in London where we have Housing First that prioritises rapid rehousing for people with the most complex needs. At the same time, you need another system in place that prioritises rapid rehousing for people with lower support needs. And the main difference would be in terms of the intensity of support. And as David mentioned, we've done a feasibility study in the Liverpool City region looking at Housing First, and we did that ahead of the funding that they were then allocated by central government, and we found that without that wider housing-led approach, it was almost impossible to implement Housing First at scale successfully, because it would become flooded as a model.
Okay, thank you very much. Assembly Member Devenish, you're going to follow up with more questions about what's happening elsewhere.
Yes. Can I ask for some context first? Because I think we all know you guys do a great job, but what this paper we've been given anyway by our officers doesn't actually do, doesn't actually say who does what. There's no mention at all of the government recent paper in here. There's hardly any mention in terms of what the boroughs do and then the partners. And what would be really helpful, David, maybe post-meeting, is a basic chart that shows what the government does, where the money flows down, where does it go to the GLA, what do the boroughs do and what do the partners do? Because I broadly know, because I've been a councillor forever, but I think anybody watching this will be confused when we almost go straight into a name, Housing First, which doesn't mean anything to anybody who's not within the specialities
Assembly Member
you
Devenish,
guys.
we are exploring Housing First specifically today.
Yeah, but you've got to have some
if you have
context.
questions about the government funding, the question we're proposing to ask to Hannah about what's going on around the UK would be a good way to get more information about that.
I think the point is that there's not even any mention of the government trying to end rough sleeping by 2028, was it? 2027. So just the context, I wouldn't be quite useful, but I'll ask my question now. Thank you, Chair. And my question within context would have been helpful is, how popular is the Housing First model in the UK, please?
Is that a question for me?
Yes, sorry, you're down for that, Hannah,
Okay,
sorry.
cool. So in terms of popularity, we know that it's gained sort of significant political interest in this issue. So at the beginning of last summer, the government allocated £28 million to Greater Manchester, the Liverpool City region and the West Midlands to pilot the Housing First approach. In the last couple of years, we have seen a fairly significant increase in the number of Housing First projects that are run in England. So there are around 32 projects that provide Housing First assistance to between around 300 to 400 people. As I mentioned earlier, we've done some research that looks specifically at the number of people in London, but also across the whole of Great Britain that would be or should be eligible for Housing First, and that stands at around 18,500. So even though we have seen an increase in the number of projects, there's certainly still a huge demand for provision nationally. The other issue in terms of popularity is, whilst we've seen a fairly significant growth in the number of Housing First projects operating across England, there have been concerns or interest around the fidelity of those projects in terms of their model. So there was a piece of research that was conducted by Homeless Link in 2015, and it was looking at the extent to which projects that claim to be Housing First are really delivering Housing First in terms of particularly the intensity of the support that they provided. And actually quite a lot of those projects could probably be more accurately described as housing-led approaches to ending homelessness. So as Mark described, the real difference with Housing First is that support is unconditional and it is open-ended. And even if somebody doesn't access support for 2 or 3 years, say after a 5-year period of accessing support, they can go back to that project and access support later on. And that kind of support wasn't necessarily being operated by all of the projects. So in terms of popularity, definitely significant interest in growing more projects and significant interest both from government, but obviously also Labour have also committed to this as a policy if they were in power as well.
And in terms of ending rough sleeping by 2027, how much of a component of the complex process to do that is the Housing First model?
So in terms of the government's current commitment, obviously they've dedicated funding to piloting Housing First. In terms of ending rough sleeping, Housing First wouldn't necessarily work for that entire cohort. So we've estimated that it's around 18,500 people across Great Britain that would be eligible, which probably makes up around, gosh, off the top of my head, about a fifth of people who are sleeping rough. So it's definitely...
Sorry? A third, did you say?
A fifth.
How many, what proportion of people sleeping rough is the 18,000?
So in terms of, sorry, say that again. proportion of people sleeping rough.
Yeah, you just said it.
So, yeah, sorry, I should have been clearer. So the 18...
You rattle it, you're going very fast.
Sorry. So the 18,500 figure is for England, Scotland and Wales. Of that figure, a proportion will be people who are sleeping rough, but a much higher proportion will be people in the hostel system, because there are many more people who are cycling around in the hostel system than they are sleeping rough. So I can definitely provide a breakdown for the committee in terms of the number of people who are sleeping rough versus the number of people in the hostel system.
Yeah, I mean, that's my final point,
Yeah.
really. But maybe David and Hannah together can come up with a nice simple diagram chart for those that don't do this for a living 24/7. So it's nice and clear who does what are you trying to achieve, how are you going to meet the government's, because a lot of people have expressed some surprise my government has said we're going to end this by 2027. I just want to know how we're going to do it.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's worth saying in terms of around MHC, if you know, the government's commitment in terms of their piloting of Housing First. They've been very clear, because we've had conversations with them, that they will not commit any further central money until these pilots have taken place and been fully evaluated, which I think in the sector has caused, has caused some potential ripples, because Housing First has been extensively evaluated in other areas. As Hannah said, Crisis have carried out extensive evaluations. There have been extensive evaluations from the work in Finland, and I think there is a little bit concerned that they're going to wait 3 years until this has actually been properly done in terms of in those areas before they're going to do an evaluation and then come back. We would imagine and say, yes, this works, in which case you've already lost 3 years where you could potentially have been funding it in other areas. So I think there is a concern in terms of around that. In terms of the government's commitment, obviously how they measure, how they're going to be measuring their success is based on the count, so is based on that one-off snapshot across the country, because that's all the information that they have available. So yes, so that's how they're planning on measuring it. Their targets are to halve it within this Parliament and then end it at the end of the following Parliament. I think they might be, there might be more ending the need for rough sleeping rather than necessarily ending rough sleeping, but that would be my kind of personal view in terms of around that target.
That's very helpful, thank you.
Samuel McKern, did you have a point of clarification?
Just a quick question to Hannah. From the 18,500 people that need your services, do you have any information on the nationality of those people? I mean, how many are UK citizens, how many Polish, Romanian and other sort of nationalities that we know that there's a big problem with homelessness within in the UK?
So we don't actually have a nationality breakdown in terms of that 18,500 figure. So that number is largely drawn from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation work on destitution. And I know that a significant proportion of people within that study were non-UK nationals and had become destitute as a result of that. The number also draws upon the Lang-Kelly Chase Hard Edges research, which looks at multiple disadvantage and exclusion, but we don't actually have a nationality breakdown, and it's one of the things that I would recommend if London was looking at Housing First and they were looking at a feasibility study in terms of scaling up, that would be something to take into account. So looking particularly at multiple needs amongst non-UK nationals, because as I'm sure you'll be aware, there will be additional barriers for that group of people in terms of accessing housing support, and that will obviously impact in terms of the success that Housing First can have amongst that group of people. But we don't currently have a breakdown in terms of the 18,500 figure. What you probably could do on Chain is, and I don't think this is publicly available, I'm sure the cross-reference is possible, is look at the number of people who have more than one support need, and I think that proportion has been rising in the last couple of years, and cross-reference that with people's nationality, because that is available on Chain.
Yeah. Okay. So you could carry out that analysis on Chain. I think the difficulty very much is that obviously part of the funding in relation to Housing First is in relation to housing benefit, and obviously if a group is not eligible for housing benefit, which the likelihood is that those individuals, if non-UK nationals, especially those without access to that, the funding that is required becomes even higher, because obviously you haven't got the money in terms of from welfare to cover those other costs. So I think it's very difficult, and I don't think any of the pilots that the government are funding will be working with non-UK nationals. Obviously the issue in other areas of the country is not quite so high. So in London, in the last count in terms of Chain, 52% of those people on the streets were non-UK nationals. Obviously, it's very difficult in terms of the service offer that we have for that group if they're not eligible for welfare. One of the things that the Mayor has been calling for is the opening up of welfare for time limited for that group, so we can help provide more interventions for that group and help get that group back.
The committee has looked at rough sleeping in general not that long ago, and we explored this issue as well. I need to move on to the next section. Assemblymember Copley, you're going to talk more about the evidence.
Thank you. Yes. So to Hannah, first of all, in your experience, is Housing First successful in sustainably housing chronically homeless people with complex needs?
So there is overwhelming international evidence as well as evidence from the UK to show that for people who have high and complex needs, Housing First is incredibly successful in terms of tenancy sustainment. So it tends to work for around 80% of people who have high and complex needs.
And are you measuring success in terms of tenancy sustainment, or have you got other measures as well?
Yeah, so Housing First is principally measured in terms of tenancy sustainment, but there is evidence that it's also very successful in terms of improving other kind of health and wellbeing outcomes as well. So one of the pieces of evidence that I'd sort of strongly recommend having a look at is the piece that was done by the University of York in 2015. So they looked at 9 Housing First projects around England, I think, and they were looking specifically not only at tenancy sustainment but also improvements in terms of health, so physical and mental health outcomes, but also in terms of addiction to drugs and alcohol as well. And for all of those categories there were improvements shown.
So even though there's no compulsion on people to access services, it's actually more likely that people will end up accessing the services.
Yeah, I think what's really important to note around Housing First is that it is aimed at a cohort of people who've been repeatedly excluded from services. They're a group of people that often have things done to them rather than having control and choice over the support they receive and the way that they receive it. And actually that's where having a lack of conditionality between support and housing is really, really important in terms of helping them to access support. So it really is about enabling people to make their own choice about how they access it and the way in which they access support services, if that makes sense. And what that can mean on a shorter term basis is that people don't necessarily engage in support in the immediate stages, but in the long term they actually sort of have a more sustainable relationship with the way that they access support, and it is much more successful.
So would you say, based on the evidence, Housing First is more successful at housing chronically homeless people with complex needs than traditional ways of doing things?
Yeah, so we commissioned a What Works review, so looking specifically at rough sleeping services and services for people with complex needs last year as part of our plan to end homelessness. And what we found was that there is a significant lack of evidence around hostels and supported accommodation in terms of their ability to move people on from homelessness. So it's not so much that there is an overwhelming amount of evidence to show that they are less successful. We do have more kind of experiential evidence from people who are using supported housing in the hostel system to show that it doesn't necessarily work particularly well for people with high and complex needs. So when we carried out the feasibility study in the Liverpool City region, the researchers undertook a number of qualitative interviews with frontline workers, but also people who had experience of using the homelessness system there. And what they found was that it wasn't working for a number of groups.
So the traditional services, sorry,
yes.
or Housing First, wasn't working for people with high and complex needs?
Yeah, so in terms of traditional services, I'm kind of referring to hostels. Yeah, so hostels.
Is it the staircase approach?
Yeah. So essentially a system that requires people to move through a number of transitional stages before they're able to access permanent accommodation. And what we found was for people who have high and complex needs, living alongside other people, so on a congregate site in a hostel, for example, who also are facing similar challenges, so other people who have addictions, who have very severe mental health problems, that can prove a very chaotic environment. It can be very challenging for people if you're trying to get off drink and drugs yourself. One of the other things that people found particularly challenging was around that assessment process to move into permanent accommodation. So that caused people a lot of anxiety, a lot of stress around that whole entire process. There's also quite a lot of evidence from Homeless Link, so they do an annual survey every year of support that's provided to single people, and what they found is that a significant proportion of hostels and supported accommodation providers are reporting that they're having to turn people away who have high and complex needs because they simply don't have the resources or the capacity to deal with people in that situation. So it's a problem for people when they're in them, but it's also a problem in the sense that people are being turned away.
And are there any groups of entrenched rough sleepers that Housing First doesn't work for so well, or does it work across the board for people with complex needs?
Yeah, so we do tend to find that for about 10% of people who have high and complex needs, Housing First doesn't necessarily work for that group. And what that means is it might be that they need another form of supported accommodation. So that might be long-term, ongoing supported accommodation that's able to provide the kind of health care support needs that they need in that situation. Yeah.
Mark, can I put the same questions to you? Do you agree with what you've heard? Is there anything you'd like to add, or do you disagree with anything that...
No, I generally agree with it. I think there's thinking about, for us, one of our key pieces of work is Housing First for women who are experiencing complex needs. I think the hostel system for this particular group, who I think within our Fulfilling Lives project, which is funded by the Big Lottery, of the women in that project, about over 90% have experienced domestic violence. So housing that particular group within a hostel is often counterproductive and just reinforces a lot of the experiences they've had before. So Housing First has proved to be very effective for that particular group.
Excellent.
I think the other thing in terms of it not being effective is, I agree very much with there's a lot of guys who've been on the streets for a long time and have very prominent physical health conditions and may need some form of registered care type provision, and clearly that is not going to work for them. I think also ultimately the guys have to pay the rent, so if you're not going to pay the rent, then it's not going to be sustainable really. But I guess that's where the support comes in, but it's not always...
And there's an issue there with welfare. I mean, I presume would there be direct payment to landlords in the case of people going through Housing First?
Mechanism by which you can achieve that really. But I mean, I think, I don't know if we're going to get onto the barriers to where it doesn't, where it's problematic in terms of accessing private rented sector accommodation.
We come on to that I think further down the agenda. I think yes, but that's a very important point. David, could I ask you to comment on what we've heard in terms of what are your views in terms of the success or otherwise of the Housing First approach?
Sure. I mean, Finland is normally held up as being basically the Mecca in relation to Housing First, and what's achieved over there is extremely inspiring in terms of the changes they made to their hostel system and the changes they made to their supported housing. And very much over there, when it started out, there were a lot more dormitory accommodation. So they had a lot of dormitory accommodation, mass areas where there are people are sleeping in large rooms, being warehoused in large rooms. They changed that approach to being more single rooms, and also kind of Housing First coming alongside that at the same time. We are in a different position in London. We've learned a lot from psychologically informed environments in hostels. In the majority, people have their own rooms, people have their own, people have their own bathrooms. It is a very different setup to it was in Finland. I think what's also worth saying in relation to Finland, and I've been lucky enough to have quite a lot of conversations with Peter Fredriksson, who was a special advisor to the Finnish government at that time when they were looking at housing and Housing First. Was their approach. They looked at it systematically, and it was a huge investment that they made in relation to this change from what they had previously. So they were looking at investing around, I think it was around 240 million euros in terms of capital funding. There was 100 million in terms of support funding. So these are large sums of money, and it was a large change across the entire way they worked. One of the key changes, one of the key costs in relation to that was the support. So the support was offered initially on a 1-to-2 basis. So you had a caseworker working with 2 clients only, which obviously is very costly, a very costly approach, very effective approach, but is not an approach that you should be doing across the board for everyone. And I think that's something that I think we'd all agree with in terms from the panel is that Housing First works. Housing First works for a specific cohort, and you have to make sure you're getting that cohort right. Is people with very entrenched needs who the current system is not working for. The hostel system does work, and we know in terms of our clearinghouse properties they work. We've got a 97% tenancy sustainment rate in clearinghouse, which we just provide, which has floating support. We learned from our Housing First pilot that we did back in 2011 in terms of looking at more of a housing-led approach in relation to clearinghouse properties. So we do take some people that have got high support straight from the streets into that accommodation. However, that is not Housing First, because if someone is in a clearinghouse property, they have to engage with support. And that is very something, that's the agreement we have with the registered associate landlords that provide that stock, is that support will be provided, and so that support is mandatory coming in. So it's not pure Housing First. And I think that's where things can get quite difficult. And I know you asked at the beginning for a definition of what Housing First is, and it is difficult, there has been much debate within the sector. And the purity of the Housing First model, which, like I say, came from Finland and from Canada, was very much that everyone is given a tenancy for life, and they are given support when they need it throughout the course of their life. That is very difficult to achieve in a commissioned-based, in England, where you're commissioning services on a 2 to 5 year cycle, to actually say that person's going to have support forever and going to have a tenancy forever is very, very difficult to do, and should only be for those people who actually really need that support. I think the other thing I would say is that in terms of even within Finland, even within Helsinki, the numbers of rough sleepers that are there, that are now on the street and in long-term homelessness, is still relatively high. Although they have, provided a solution for many people, I think their last count was back in 2017, and there were 1,000, I think it was just over 1,000 rough sleepers in Helsinki, which is actually a higher number in terms of comparatively than we have in London. So I think although Finland is held up as being the model in relation to Housing First and how successful Housing First can be, there are still some challenges and limitations with that model. And yes, it should be part of the solution, it should be part of the toolkit that we use in relation to tackling rough sleeping. But as Hannah's mentioned, this is not just, Housing First is not just about rough sleeping. If you're going this purist model, you're looking at helping people who are struggling in tenancies currently. You're looking at helping people that are in TA and getting people straight from TA into housing. So it is very much across the board rather than just tackling rough sleeping.
Okay, thank you. And just quickly, this sort of relates to Assembly Member Curtin's question earlier, but are there any restrictions in terms of who is eligible to access Housing First in terms of immigration status? So is it open to EU nationals, non-EU nationals, and what will happen after Brexit?
That varies depending on the individual project. And depending on how the individual project is funded. The majority of cases is that individuals have to be eligible for benefits to move into it, because that's how the rent is going to, is going to be paid. So therefore, an EU national who's eligible for benefits, which there will be some, obviously have worked before, who previously worked, they will be able to go, they will be eligible for Housing First. If you're not eligible for welfare, in the main, there are very few Housing First projects that you could access.
Could I move on to you now, Stuart, and Spear's approach? And can you outline for us Spear's homelessness service, which follows the Housing First principles?
For sure. So, just to say, I don't really recognise the difference between the traditional approach and the Housing First approach. There are principles of Housing First which I think are quite common in the sector, not universal. And the way that we work in Spear, we wouldn't call it Housing First necessarily, but many of the principles would adhere to. So we provide if we focus on the borough of Richmond-upon-Thames, we provide a pathway. So we kind of work with people on the streets. We have short-term emergency accommodation. We have a hostel that's a psychologically informed environment. So it's a recovery hostel, a high level of staffing and partnerships with other agencies, etc. We have second stage shared supported accommodation. And then we have independent accommodation that's time limited, and there's an exit into both social housing and private rented sector accommodation, which we broker, and there's tenancy support in that independent accommodation. So it's staircases, but it's not delivered in a fashion that's been described in the traditional model, which is if you don't engage with an addiction service, then you can't move on, and otherwise you'll be evicted. So we wouldn't work in that way. So it's strength-based, it's person-centred, and it works extremely well. So we have kind of tenancy sustainment rates in the kind of 90% region once people are in independent accommodation, and across the board, so even in the direct access hostels, including that 84% tenancy sustainment rate. So it works very well. The principles of Housing First that we recognise are very much that, you know, to engage people with complex needs, you need to build trust, because if you've had trauma and if you have complex needs, you accept support from people you trust, and you trust people that you believe have your best interests at heart. So the approach that's described in Housing First of saying, well, how can I help you? What support can we provide? Where do you want to go in your life? Is much more effective than if you do A and B, you'll move on, and if you don't, we'll evict you. So that's not an approach that we'd ever advocate at Spear. It's not, in my experience, very common in the homelessness sector, generally speaking. It is common, however, in the provision of statutory services. So if you're going to engage in mental health provision or addiction services, it's often, there are thresholds in that way. If you don't meet certain criteria, then you'll be, you won't be able to stay in the service, essentially. So we did have some Housing First funding from the GLA, which wasn't, so the service wasn't delivered in isolation. It was kind of integrated into the rest of the services we provided in Richmond and Wandsworth. And essentially what it enabled us to do was to have additional staff, so the staff to client ratio was lower, so a smaller number of people had more support. And undoubtedly that helps. It helps a lot. So if you have staff who are paid reasonably well, and you have a staff to client ratio that's more generous, then people get more support, they do better. If you have, so in our case we provide our own accommodation, or we manage it, so some of it's our supported shared housing, some of it's independent accommodation. If we're effectively the landlord, then we can be much more tolerant, and we take an approach we describe in the sector of taking positive risks. So we know if we move someone into an independent accommodation or a small shared supported housing scheme where there's no staff on site, there might be 4 people living together and somebody visiting every so often, we're taking a positive risk. So if you have more staff support, you can take more positive risk, and if you're the landlord, even more so. When you're working with housing associations as partners with private renter sector landlords, you're somewhat limited because tenancies have conditions. If you're even if we're supporting someone in a social housing unit, if somebody doesn't pay their arrears or behaves in a certain way, they'll breach their tenancy agreement. So from a pure perspective, you have limited control over the tenancy management if you're not the landlord. If you are, it's easier. But even if you increase the staffing and you have skilled staff and you have more staff to client ratio, you're still limited in the support you can provide, the wraparound support you can provide for this cohort, if you don't have robust partnerships with mental health, addiction, physical health partners. So an issue that we often face is, for example, we might have somebody with very serious mental health issues. For their long-term, for their tenancy sustainment long-term, they need to engage in mental health treatment. The local mental health services don't have a bespoke way of either promoting access to or engagement in health treatment. They don't have a bespoke way of kind of multi-agency case management with voluntary sector partners. So you might spend a year lobbying a local mental health service to take on one of your clients. You may or may not be successful in that, and if the mental health issues aren't addressed, that client's recovery is inhibited by that. So for us, we don't look at the housing issue on its own. We look at the support we provide, the partnerships and what we need from our kind of health partners, and also the cooperation that we need from our landlords.
So is that how you would is that sort of differ from traditional housing first, as well, mainstream housing first? Or?
Well, coming back to what Mark said at the beginning, if you define housing first as a set of principles, then I'd say the principles, we deliver them and have done for some time, whether we call it housing first or not. But there's limitations to the application of not the principles necessarily, because the principles are quite generic, but in terms of the purity of the kind of provide the housing regardless of whether somebody engages in support or not, you're limited by the nature of the tenancies depending on who you're working with, whether you're providing it yourself or you're supporting people to move into social housing, for example. So my view is that to take this forward, and what we're doing in our area kind of independently with partners, is to kind of develop the partnership working with both the registered provider partners, so they're on board if you're taking positive risks with people who are going to move into tenancies and you recognise the risk of there being problems is higher. So to develop the partnerships with the registered provider and also with the local health and addiction, particularly mental health and addiction treatment providers and commissioners, with us, the charity providing the services, and council colleagues. And when you bring those together, then you have a much greater chance of success in people being ready and wanting themselves to move into independent accommodation sooner. The other thing just to add is that I don't recognise that hostel, I mean, not everyone said this, but the kind of assumption is that hostels or shared supported housing projects aren't effective. They can be, and for some of our clients, if we would say to them, would you like to move into a hostel in the area that we've developed a relationship with you, would you like to move into a hostel where you're currently residing on the streets and you know us and you know if you move into the hostel you'll get this type of support, or would you like to go into an independent accommodation but out of borough, so another part of London? The majority of our clients would say, I'll move into the hostel. For some of our residents, they'd say, well, I'd rather be in the hostel for a period and stabilise, and then I'll move on to independent accommodation later. That's the client's choice, and our view is it's in their interest to give people the option. So I wouldn't advocate kind of the provision of independent accommodation in lieu of supported housing or hostel provision, but I would say the hostel provision needs to be resourced in a way that enables more intensive support, so that the staircasing is client-led as opposed to punitive.
We've actually moved on slightly as well to the question 8 in terms of the mayor's the funding that the mayor has given to the project.
Can we carry on discussing the nature of this? Because once you've gone back to Mark, I've got a couple of questions about the types of clients, and I think Assembly Member Devonish wants to.
I just wanted to sort of finish off with a question about whether you think Housing First is always the appropriate service for chronically homeless people with complex needs. It sounds like you're saying not necessarily.
Depends how you define it. If you said that there's a provision of independent accommodation with a high level of support that's delivered on a multi-agency basis for people as early as they want to move into independent accommodation, then I'd say undoubtedly it'd be kind of, could be hard to justify any other position. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the hostel, if it's a recovery-focused hostel or shared supported housing, doesn't also have its place in somewhat of a staircase approach, because many people benefit. So, picking up on what Mark said earlier about women's provision. So we have homeless women, we've been having bespoke services for women that have been street homeless with domestic violence, etc. And what we do is women's only supported housing projects on quite a small scale, so like 4 or 5 women living together. And the women, they love that. They'd rather live in a house with, 3 or 4 other women. Men aren't allowed into the service, it's safe, the location is anonymous, and there's a peer-to-peer support element to it, there's a bit of a community, people make friends, and then that's the precursor to people moving into independent accommodation. So I think the model that we've developed at Spear is a pathway model where you have supported accommodation that precedes independent accommodation, but not always, not for everybody. And certainly, I think that if people that are street homeless or were street homeless and now in supported housing have the opportunity to get into independent accommodation as soon as possible, that's possible as soon as they want to an extent as soon as they're ready, but that's often their own assessment, more so than anyone else's. And if with that there's the support, then great. But I would say that to facilitate people moving into independent accommodation as soon as possible and to sustain it effectively, there's so much we can do ourselves in the voluntary sector, but actually it's the partnership with the statutory agencies, the mental health and the addiction providers, that needs to be improved. And if we're talking about social housing as one of the exits into long-term accommodation, then we need to work with registered providers in a more structured way. And I think together we can do this. But otherwise, people do come up against limitations of other agencies' criteria. If you breach certain rules, you can't get any mental health support. If you breach certain rules, you can't stay in a social housing provision.
Thank you.
So,
Sorry, Nikki, there's been a bit of a queue built up of members who wish to ask questions. We were going to ask Mark to comment on this question,
yes.
And then I wanted to ask something as well. So,
Mark, do you want to comment on what you've heard from the Spear about the Spear approach?
Well, I was interested. I suppose I'd need to understand a few more details, but I suppose in a sense, I guess, I know we talk about fidelity of the model and purity and such, but I guess we don't want to get too hung up on those issues. Ultimately, it's about what works, and I think if there's, for Spear and for that locality, if the approach they're taking is what's working, whether it's, if it's a variation on Housing First or not, then, I think that's primarily the issue, really.
Thank you.
And there are always there are local variations that would mean that one approach is much more appropriate than another, perhaps, and also about the access to the various types of housing. In Islington, for example, where we have a Housing First approach, they're providing social housing to support that. That's highly unusual, but incredibly positive. So those guys are getting Islington, yeah. And it's that's a pilot, but they're going to scale it up. It's 5 units at the moment. They're hoping to move.
Is that the only borough that are providing? Are they providing their own council housing, or is it
council housing? Yeah.
Southwark also have a Housing First pilot doing the same thing. I think the question is in terms of how to increase that stock. So obviously, as Mark mentioned, that's 5 units. If you're doing Housing First properly, those individuals remain in those 5 units for the rest of their life as they would like to, unless they'd like to move. So therefore, you have to make sure you're going to be increasing the stock to make it actually work. Otherwise, all you're doing is providing support for those 5 individuals, and that's going to be it. So obviously, it's how you scale up and increase that stock, and how you do that, not to the detriment of other groups who are coming in who equally, would like that housing stock. And that's a conversation that we have with our colleagues in relation to statutory housing, in terms of, is obviously the council waiting lists are very long. In terms of that's why you jump in the queue if you're going through, potentially going through this model, and rough sleepers jump in the queue in terms of those individuals who are waiting for council housing stock. So it is very difficult for a local authority to juggle that and to balance that, as you can imagine.
Just to say, in Richmond, there's we have 32 flats provided by 2 housing associations that are given the kind of access is given to the local authority, and they delegate that to us. And then we have a quota of 20 housing association flats per year every year as part of that pathway. And it works extremely effective. It's extremely effective, but nevertheless, the housing association who's signing the person up for the tenancy, both in the interim period and the long stage, they still need to assess the person as being suitable, and they're still the landlord, and they still put certain conditions on the tenancy agreement. And our support for that person is ongoing whilst they're in those tenancies, as long as they need them, but also in those kind of earlier stages in their journey into that independent accommodation. Some people will go there quite quickly, some people will be in the supported accommodation first. I think it's relatively unique what Richmond have done there.
Thank you. Okay, I have a couple more questions about the types of people different models may be suitable for, because I think, so I wanted to ask Stuart about the kinds of people who get referred to you, and whether or not you assess people for whether or not it might work for them. Because it seems to me like one of the things that's attracted me to talking about Housing First is that it's rights-based and sort of person-centred. It's people's choices, what things they take up. Whereas the traditional sort of supported housing and hostel model is more institutional, less individual. And it seems to me like what Mark's described, for example, about women who've been victims of domestic violence, who might have trauma in their lives, needing to be sort of, alone and not in a place that might be more chaotic and have more people coming in. Some people with long-term rough sleeping may be very, very individual type people. They may not respond well at all to being in an institution. Others may be more institutionalised if they've come out of prison, for example. So I can see that actually different models might work better for different kinds of people. So to go back to my question, Stuart, do you select people who might be more amenable to your sort of more highly sort of regimented to wanting to be in those stages before being in individual accommodation, or do you select people for suitability, or are you just handed people and then it works for some and not others?
We do, but it's kind of case by case, and there are certain kind of lessons you learn about what works and what doesn't, and that informs your practice. But it's kind of pretty person-centred. So I agree. There's certain general rules. For example, women that have had trauma, that have experienced domestic violence, that have been on the streets. In our experience, and I think this is generally held up, women's only provision is safer for that cohort. So if you have a woman in a large mixed gender hostel, I've seen evidence in the past that women don't do as well in that setting. Mm. But to say that women would necessarily en masse in that situation want to be in independent accommodation as opposed to a small, say a house with 4 people sharing, my experience doesn't bear that out. It might very well be the case for an individual person that they don't want to be in that shared supported housing scheme. I want to be independent, and that might be what works out best for them. But there's other people who go into an independent accommodation and it doesn't work out for them. They needed the shared supported housing with somebody holding some boundaries. I wouldn't say it's regimented. Certainly the hostel provision we provide is much more about creating a culture of recovery. It's psychologically informed. If you look at the recent report from South London and Maudsley NHS Trust, in partnership, I think, at Graham House with Thamesreach, hostels can provide opportunities for recovery and personal development that the communal living aspect of it is really important, that you wouldn't get that necessarily if someone was living alone. So it's very person-centred. We've had cases where we've had somebody who's also to a certain extent it's also compromised by availability. So there is a kind of reality check to this. If you've got a vacancy in a hostel but a waiting time for somebody to go into an independent, and both are open for somebody, there is something about availability. But most of our most complex needs clients would tend to go into the supported housing environment, but if it doesn't work for them or they don't like it, and we could provide more intensive wraparound support, then for sure independent accommodation is on the menu for them as well.
So what you said earlier was when people are ready to move on, that's their own assessment essentially. Is that the case? You don't test. There's no testing.
No, to a certain
let's see if you're ready
yes.
next month kind of thing goes on.
People don't, the client group don't fit into the kind of boxes that we might want to define them into. So just as an example, we had a lady who'd been rough sleeping for 30 years. She'd been had an addiction. She had mental health issues. She had learning difficulties. She had she'd been street working for many, many years. She was in a kind of mixed gender hostel. She was violent to another resident. She was evicted. She was back on the streets. We were still working with her because we have a kind of rough sleeper outreach service. We were still working with her. We didn't kind of say, that's it, you've blown your chances, we're not going to help you anymore. We carried on supporting her, but she couldn't stay in the accommodation. We then moved her into a smaller shared supported housing scheme. Things didn't work out there. She was bringing men in, which was against the rules. She couldn't stay there. We then moved her into an independent training flat and provided her more support there. That failed due to people taking advantage of her vulnerability and using it as a base for dealing drugs and other activities. She couldn't manage that independently. She moved back into a supported housing scheme. We then, through her choice, she was from Scotland. She wanted to go back to Scotland. We helped her resettle into an independent accommodation in Scotland. She successfully sustained that. She contacts us from time to time, asks for a little bit of advice, and she's happy, and her life stabilised. And that period of whatever it was, 5 or 6 years of her being in different services, the principles that we're talking about here were very much at the heart of the approach we took. We never rejected her. We never said, we're not going to help you anymore, we're not going to support you. We were always open to different options for her. But the chaos of her life and the difficulty in changing her habits was such that it took that sustained service through different types of models of whether it's accommodation independent or shared or supported or single gender or mixed gender. And she went through a process of growth. So I think for most of us on the ground that do the work, we're kind of person-centred. We're looking at people's strength, we're looking at their aspirations. We are also a stakeholder in terms of the support we provide and managing boundaries. And you kind of work on it together.
Okay, thank you. Mark, just finally, do you have a comment on the question of the sort of more medical, mental health type support? I mean, obviously you provide, your model provides a key worker who provides outreach and links. Do you experience the same problems in getting people access to mental health support and medical treatment for things like addiction?
We do, depending on the location. I mean, I think the reality is that, I suppose, I don't know, maybe this is where we do differ somewhat from Stuart's service. A lot of the guys that we are supporting into Housing First are on the streets when we engage with them. So they're not engaged in any services at all. I mean, the challenge is to get them engaged in services, but the principal issue is to get them engaged in our service and then get them into some form of, into the housing. And from there, the conversations can start about accessing the wraparound support. But I think, that tends to be a journey, and it tends to be much later on down the line. So, yes, those challenges exist. I think they exist for clients more generally within the population. But I think ultimately engagement that we face, the challenges we face are about engaging with the guys when they're on the streets, because they're basically locked out of the system entirely, or they've opted out of the system entirely.
Okay, thank you. Has anyone ever done a question?
I just wanted to go back to my famous point about context. Stuart, could you just mention the figure of 84% achievement, I think you said. How many people are we talking about? I know it's not that simple. And how many years have you been doing this? Because again, it's not in the papers. And perhaps Mark can give us an idea of how many people, how many customers he's got in his work as well.
So Spear's been working in South West London for 33 years. So we started off in the borough of Richmond upon Thames. We now work in Richmond, Sutton, Kingston, Wandsworth and Merton. The service is principally directed towards people that are street homeless. We have a kind of separate division that works with young homeless people. And on the street homeless services, it's outreach, it's accommodation, and we differentiate women's only provision as well. So last year we worked with, the numbers, we worked with 620 people, most of whom were street homeless, and we provided 157 tenancies, most of which were in different supported housing settings or shared housing. Probably 50 plus were kind of independent accommodation units. Is
that's perfect. I just want to get kind of feel for.
Yeah, so we have 4 Housing First projects at the moment. One in Newham, where we currently have 15 people housed. That was in it's funded to that level. So I think they'd look to double that for the next year if the funding's available. We also have around 15 in Redbridge. Again, we could ramp that up if the funding was available for the additional workers. And then we have 2 projects operating across Camden and Islington. We have the Fulfilling Lives project, where there's about 15 people. And then we have the pilot in Islington, which has 5 in it at the moment.
Thank you.
Thank you, Samuel Davnish. I mean, obviously the meeting's point is to ask questions, not necessarily to have all the information in front of us. We're not holding these people to account. We're here to explore the issues with them now in this meeting.
One person, that's all great, but it is good to get some context.
That's why you asked. It's a good question. Thank you for asking it. But yeah, that's all. Hannah, you wanted to come back on something.
Yeah, just on that point of context and what we find overwhelmingly from our services. So we provide services, frontline services in England, Scotland and Wales, and we do have 3 delivery centres in London, so in Shoreditch, Croydon and up in Brent. And we deliver service to around 11,000 people and around 4,000 people in London. And what we overwhelmingly hear from people when we ask them what is needed to end their homelessness is a home. And often when people tell us that they don't necessarily want that, it's because their experience of living independently hasn't been matched with the appropriate type of support that they need. So whether or not we're working with people with low support needs or high support needs, we almost all of the time find that housing, scattered housing within communities, is the answer to their homelessness. And we actually commissioned, so we worked with Hammersmith and Fulham Council about 18 months ago, and it was working on a commission that they had around what was needed to end rough sleeping within that borough. And as part of that piece of work, we commissioned Groundswell, so a homelessness charity that operate there, to interview 108 people who had experience of sleeping rough in the borough. And of those 108 people, only 2 people told us that they wanted to move into a hostel. So there was a lot of concern amongst people with high and low support needs about moving through a sort of transitional temporary accommodation before they move into housing. So I think even if people say, I do want something else, it tends to be because their experience of living independently hasn't been matched with that support. And overwhelmingly, housing and homes are what are needed in order to end people's homelessness.
Okay, thank you. Assembly Member Gavron, your question there. Thank you.
My whole question, okay. I just wanted to ask one thing about, I think it's of Mark, which when you talked about, I think it's Mark or Spear, talked about people, women sharing. And is that for life?
Well, that's, yeah.
Spear,
So,
is that
no.
for life? You talked about women wanting to be together sharing.
No. No,
It's
so
not for life.
we deliver, it might sound a bit kind of old-fashioned, but we deliver a pathway. So the pathway typically is if somebody could move from the streets into independent accommodation, but normally...
And that would be for life, would it?
Not necessarily, but normally move into a shared housing, which is either kind of a slightly larger scale hostel or a smaller scale shared supported housing project. So the women's projects that we have a number of them, are small, so it's like 3 to 4 people living in a house together. It's time limited because there's a continual flow of people every year, and when women would normally be there for a period of time and then move on into independent accommodation. Some of the independent accommodation we provide is time limited, so it's for 2 years where we provide more intensive support. And often that's a precursor to social housing when we're in Richmond, because Richmond makes social housing available to us, 20 units a year. Other boroughs don't do that. So if it happens to be in Richmond, then there's a kind of step on. If it's outside of Richmond, we typically broker somebody's access to private rented sector accommodation. The issue with that is that the tenure is actually much less secure, so a private landlord can at any time say, well, I want to sell the property, you can't stay there any longer. Or they might want to put the rent up or what have you. So private rented sector accommodation as a kind of exit is less satisfactory than social housing, which is typically kind of essentially a home for life. So yeah, I mean, just to go back on what I said earlier, I think if you were in a situation where there were a much greater availability of social housing or a secure tenure and a sure tenancy for life, I think more people would take it that were in supported housing if there was the right kind of support for them.
Yeah, because the point, I suppose the point is that we're talking about people with very, entrenched, they've come off the streets, entrenched homelessness and very complex needs. And it's in the nature of it that they're going to need some kind of support for their lives, aren't they? Isn't that the point?
Not necessarily.
No.
We have many people that were entrenched rough sleepers with complex needs who, a few years down the line, live independently with little or no support. We also have people that...
And these are people with complex needs?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
We have people that work for us. We have 10% of our workforce have experienced street homelessness. So people do recover. Not to sound like a broken record, but often the recovery is underpinned by both the stability of their housing, but also the effective joint working between us and what we provide, and also our partners in mental health provision and in addiction services and in physical health provision as well, with a cooperative landlord, i.e. typically a housing association. So when that comes together, then people do recover much more effectively.
Okay, well then I better move on to my proper question. Is that right?
Yeah.
You want me to
Thank
now?
you, yes.
Okay. I don't know how comfortable I feel with this question, but anyway, it's about comparative costs in a way. The research seems to be inconclusive about the cost savings to home. This is a Housing First, to government services, to local authority services, to homeless charity services, and that's in the longer term. The costs seem to be, the cost savings are not really. I mean, the research is inconclusive on these cost savings. Now, I don't know what experience people have of this, so I'd like to leave it open as to who answers first. But if that's the case, what research is needed?
So we've done some research into this, and I've brought a copy today of a report produced by the Young Foundation. So comparable to Mark's organisation, we were funded by the Big Lottery to deliver a health and homelessness service. So it's particularly to build bridges between our client group and health providers. So, we find that people with complex needs, street homeless people or ex-street homeless people with complex needs often have had, don't really want to engage in mainstream provision, and also that mainstream provision doesn't easily engage with this cohort. So this is like mental health, physical health, primary care, addiction is better. So when we deliver a service to bridge the gap, the access in health provision goes up significantly. Most people do want to engage in health treatment if they have the support from us and they've built the relationship and the rapport. They tend to stay engaged longer and their health improves. So the Young Foundation did some evaluation, and it's extremely hard to find the kind of metrics to measure cost savings, but they've done it nevertheless, but quite a limited fashion. So they've looked at reduced A&E attendances, so reduced people going to primary care instead of accident and emergency, reduced ambulance call-out, and reduced inpatient stay in wards as opposed to kind of health treatment in the community. So there's evidence from our work in that field. We're not alone, so the Department of Health and St Mungo's and Homeless Link and kind of other organisations, there's kind of emerging research around the costs to the health sector from a kind of voluntary sector kind of partnership with health agencies, and other reports have been carried out into cost savings to the public purse, and I think we all intuitively understand and anecdotally understand that there are savings through prevention and through kind of upstream work in the community, but I don't think there's definitive evidence, so much so that there'd be a business case to persuade, for example, CCGs or NHS trusts or the NHS to kind of put some of its funding more upstream. And I think one of the reasons that is that the evidence that's been collated so far as I can understand, comes from the voluntary sector databases, not from the NHS database. So one of the recommendations to the Young Foundation is, as this service carries on, is for us to try and work with the NHS so that we can use their data for the kind of shared client group. So the business case about the cost savings comes from within the NHS, where it's more likely to drive spending at their end around prevention and saving money elsewhere.
Is that comparative to what would have happened if the person being helped wasn't in Housing First, but was on the street or in a hostel? Or
so I think for us, you can't say it with 100% certainty, and just to clarify, it's not necessarily just the Housing First service, it's Spiers services more generally. But in our case, we looked at of a cohort of people, the number of A&E attendances and ambulance call-outs before and then after, and it had definitely reduced. So I'd say the evidence is relatively robust, but you can't say 100% that the A&E attendances and ambulance call-outs wouldn't have gone down anyway, but probably not without the support.
This was it was one of the things that we focused in on when we did the feasibility study in the Liverpool City region.
You get to speak close to your mic.
Get close to this one. So when we did the study in the Liverpool City region, one of the key factors of that study was looking at cashable savings for all the boroughs in the Liverpool City region, and we modelled two different scenarios of implementing Housing First. So the first was quite a conservative implementation, so just for the people who needed Housing First, alongside existing provision. And the second scenario looked at introducing Housing First for the cohort of people that were identified alongside homelessness prevention interventions and also a wider housing-led model as well. In that first scenario, what we found was that after around 5 years of implementation, there were cashable savings for the entire Liverpool City region of just over £1 million. But if you implemented Housing First as part of a broader strategy that also focused on prevention and housing-led solutions, there were cashable savings of over £4 million for the Liverpool City region. So I think in terms of cashable savings, I think quite often we talk about savings for health and things in terms of admissions, which is very, very useful, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to close an entire A&E and that you're actually going to see cashable savings. So we looked at what we could save in terms of cash across health and justice budgets, but also across housing and homelessness budgets as well.
One of the crucial things you said, after about 5 years, and the question also has in the longer term.
Yes. So I think
this is housing for life,
and
you've got to look in the
exactly. And I think what's really, really important to say is that if you do Housing First properly and to sort of in line with the principles, and it's a high fidelity model, then it isn't necessarily cheaper as a solution compared to other homelessness services and current provision. But what we do know is it's more effective, so it is better value for money. What we also found in the Liverpool City region in terms of scaling Housing First up appropriately and responsibly, you would have to double fund existing services alongside Housing First for about 1 to 2 years. So during that period there would potentially be additional spend. It wouldn't necessarily be cheaper, but in the long run you would see cashable savings, particularly if it's done as part of that broader homelessness prevention and housing-led strategy.
Do you have a view on this, David?
In terms of around the money, is that it depends on the fidelity of the model and depends on where you go with it. I think our view is that Housing First should be part of the toolkit. It should be if you're working with the most entrenched on the streets, a personalised solution is what you should be working with. It's what we do in the social impact bond. If you know which works with the 350 of the most entrenched individuals on the streets in London, we operate in a very much personalised approach, and that is. We work with the providers, St Mungo's and Thames Reach. We pay them based on outcomes rather than the model they have to go through. So we pay on accommodation outcomes for the individual to get into accommodation, then to sustain that accommodation. We don't say what that kind of accommodation is. We don't say that it has to go through a pathway. So we know personalised solutions work for the most entrenched. Having people have to go through hoops and jump through hoops in terms of that kind of old style standard classic, this is the pathway off the streets that you have to go through, does not work for the most entrenched, but it will work for quite a few people, for quite a number of people. And so it's trying to have that personalised approach is what's going to work. In terms of, is Housing First cheaper? No, it's not. It's not going to be a cheaper approach. If you know what I mean, it will, as Hannah said, it's more likely to potentially be really successful for a group of people. What we found from the small pilot we did previously was that it's very difficult to predict the individuals which is going to work for and it's not going to work for. I was in Westminster at that time, so we put forward people to be part of this pilot. I think we put forward 5 people. I thought 3 of them would do really well. 2 of them wouldn't. 2 of them, I was like, blimey, they've been around every single hostel. It's never going to work for those 2 at all. 3 of them worked, 2 of them didn't. It wasn't the 2. 2 of the people that I predicted would. Fell out of it within 6 months. It didn't work for them at all. They couldn't cope, in terms of living on their own. They weren't quite ready for that. So it's very difficult to predict. I think it should be part of the toolkit. We should be looking at taking people straight from the streets into accommodation if that's what they wish, and that's what we think is going to work for them. But it needs to be a balanced approach. I don't think you can say that you should disinvest in every single hostel and turn everything into Housing First. That's not going to be the best approach, and that's not what they've done in Finland. And I think everyone harks to Finland and says they've done everything. Everyone gets their own flat. They don't. Lots of people get supported housing based in blocks, which is very similar to what we do in terms of round hostels. So I think it's got to be that mixed approach.
Would anyone else want to comment on what's been said by David?
Just in terms of the Finland stuff, I think what is really important and the biggest distinction between their model and what we have here, because I definitely agree that they definitely have more dormitory style accommodation compared to here. Like, we have a more advanced supported accommodation system, but everybody, even if they're living in congregate sites in Finland, does have their own tenancy, and that has to be the biggest difference between what goes on there and what goes in here in terms of security of tenancy. So even if people are living together in congregate blocks and they have their own flat, they should have security of tenancy. Like, there's no need for not providing that within a supported accommodation system.
Tenure.
So, I mean, it depends on the tenure. So Housing First can certainly work in the private rented sector, and it is working in London in the private rented sector. If it's in the social rented sector, that tenancy is more likely to be for life, but we wouldn't necessarily see a barrier in terms of people moving into the private rented sector. I think the most important thing about Housing First in terms of housing and the choice that people have is that it should reflect generally what other people are experiencing in the market. And there are lots of people here living in the private rented sector, and we don't necessarily see that as a barrier to people moving into Housing First.
Just in terms of the research and the evidence for this question about costs, which I tend to see this as a moral and humane issue, and not as a cost-saving issue. But on the other hand, it's back to what you said, is what's effective and what works. But do you think there's some, just as a last bit to this question, do you think there's some gaps in the evidence, and what is it we really want?
I certainly think there's a gap in London, and I think that's why, if you were undertaking a feasibility study here, that analysis of the cost effectiveness of Housing First would have to be essential. So we could look at what we'd learned in Liverpool, but the provision in terms of accommodation between Liverpool and London is very, very different. So, for example, in Liverpool there was a lot of expensive supported accommodation, and that's why we saw some of the savings that we did. In London we have a lot more large-scale hostels, so that would affect the extent to which we saw cashable savings. I think undoubtedly there would be cashable savings in London, but we would have to model that looking specifically at the context here and the provision of services.
Anyone else want to comment?
Well, I agree with David's point that I think it's part of a toolkit, and not to kind of, as I said earlier, disregard the place of supported housing. And I think if the issue was, slightly repeating myself, but if it's about the provision of more accommodation that's more secure, independent accommodation that's more secure earlier on, if there were more of that, I think undoubtedly that would be a positive thing. The funding for the charities principally that are providing the support needs to go up, so there needs to be more support at our end. But you know, what Mark said earlier is right, that there's a kind of piece of work to engage people in the support you're providing, but if they're kind of entrenched and not engaging in any support whatsoever, that's the first step. And then not to disregard the challenge of the next step, which is that people need support from mental health, physical health and addiction services as well as the support from yourself as a charity. And that's not an easy thing to do. You know, and from a commissioning perspective, I'd really like to see on a local basis or sub-regional basis, a smaller number of boroughs working together, the local council, the local charity, the local health treatment partners and the registered providers working together on this to find a solution for that locality. Because if you have all the partners together, you're much more likely to succeed in this aim than if the health treatment providers in particular, what they're bringing is mainstream provision as opposed to kind of bespoke provision.
So that's one of the bits of research that needs to be done, because partnership working in the way you're suggesting would be more cost effective as well as effective for the
I think it would be both, yeah.
I want to ask one very quick question before we move on. Are you done?
I am done.
Thank you. We're talking about saving money, but one of the things that rough sleepers and people with multiple problems experience is really high levels of mortality and low life expectancy. Obviously, that's a long-term outcome. Has anyone looked? Do we know if there's any evidence of improved sort of health outcomes in that respect? Obviously, Stuart, you talked about ambulance call-outs, but one would expect people living in secure accommodation with support needs to have much lower rates of mortality than people living on the streets, and has that been looked at all yet?
I think it's definitely worth looking at some of the research that's been conducted by the University of York on this. So they looked at tenancy sustainment, but they also looked at improvements in mental and physical health. They also considered things like use of A&E, because we know that that's one of the biggest differences between people who are living on the streets and are facing kind of high and complex needs, is that they end up having to use A&E as if it is their GP service, because they face such extreme barriers in terms of accessing, and they did consider things like that as well. And I think because that research is specifically looking within the context here in this country, that would be a useful one to consider.
Okay. Yeah, so like I said, I'm not particularly comfortable putting cash values on things like that, but you can put value on a year lost.
They've also done quite a lot of evaluation of a Housing First project that I'd really recommend that the committee looks up in Manchester as well, called Threshold. So they work specifically with women who are experiencing multiple and complex needs, and as Stuart's described, this is a group of people for whom Housing First works particularly well, and they have also looked at a lot of those other elements in terms of health outcomes as well as the tenancy sustainment model.
Okay, thank you. We need to move on now, and Assemblymember Curtin has some questions about how it gets delivered in London.
Yeah, thanks. So mainly I'll be thinking about how it's Housing First is delivered in London. So if I could ask you, Mark, first of all, I mean, you're piloting lots of services in London boroughs. What are the main difficulties that you're finding with, doing the services in the London boroughs that you work with?
Well, it varies from one to another, but I guess the primary challenge is actually accessing accommodation, really. The private rented market is challenging. The LHA rates are set at such a rate that it's difficult to access housing, particularly local housing in the boroughs where we're operating. So ideally, the guys that we work with would want to live or remain living where they are, but that proves a challenge because we can't afford accommodation. I think also there's an incredible amount of competition for private rented accommodation, particularly, well, now where guys who are claiming benefits are where they're willing to take those guys, because the councils are all competing for this accommodation for their own homeless population. So that's one of the main challenges, really. So I think the other one is actually staff, and getting the right quality and the right experienced staff, because I think recently we've seen quite a bit of money come into the sector from the Rough Sleeping Initiative and so forth. So actually there's a lot of these projects have started up, and so we're struggling to recruit the people with the sort of credentials that we need to deliver this sort of service.
Okay, thanks. You mentioned that you've got 5 units from Islington Council, so that is something that's happening in some of the boroughs. But what other social housing providers have helped you with accommodation, or is that something that is particularly?
Well, that's very particular to that borough, and they took the decision to go down that route, and it's something we welcome. But other boroughs, where the services have commissioned, we're largely reliant on private rented accommodation. I know that Hackney are going out to the market for a new service, and they're looking for the provider to bring with them a registered provider to offer the units. So that's another option, but it's not something that we're familiar with so much.
What about other social housing providers apart from councils? Do you sort of work with them at all, or have you got any sort of help from them?
No, we haven't had any help from them. No. I know Stuart's described his very different scenario, but for us, it's definitely the private rented market. For you and also for Stuart as well, I would like to ask you, how do you think the Mayor could help you source accommodation for what you do? Is there anything he could do that you've thought of that could add to your strategy? Well, I guess it's the amount of influence that he has on central government, really, ultimately. I think we haven't seen any increase in the LHA rates at all, so ultimately, actually, that's a sort of, we're competing with a lot of other purchases. I mean, we're competing with the boroughs in terms of, we offer incentives to landlords, but then I think the local authorities are offering incentives as well to meet their Homeless Reduction Act priorities. So that's and I think this is something that's happening, is the boroughs are now beginning to sort of work more closely together, so that there is more of an economy of scale, really. But I think we would ideally we would be part of that, really, so that we could have a share of the private rented market that's being sourced by the local authorities, really, and that we're not trying to compete with them all the time.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah,
just in terms of what the Mayor could do on the situation, because obviously housing supply is, the problems are particularly acute in London, but they're also faced by other Housing First projects throughout the UK. And I couldn't agree more with Mark on the issue around local housing allowance, and anything that the Mayor can do in terms of influencing the future spending review on that and ensuring that local housing allowance rates are returned at least back to the 30th percentile would go a long way in terms of helping to access accommodation. The other thing, so to make sure I speak into the microphone, that we think would be incredibly useful in terms of sourcing accommodation, and this is something that we recommended in the Liverpool City region. Of course, they're not facing quite the housing supply problems that we are here, would be the establishment of a pan-London local lettings agency, and that would be a lettings agency that specialised and recruited staff that were specialist in managing property and acquiring property, and that property could be sourced from the private rented sector or the social rented sector. The advantage of having a pan-London local lettings agency rather than people doing it in individual areas is, first of all, it helps to overcome some of those problems that we see in terms of competition between boroughs. Also, just in terms of economy of scale, if you are managing housing like that across the whole of London, it does make housing management cheaper. What it also means is that you could deliver lettings via an agency like that, both for Housing First, but also for people with lower support needs. So what that means is it overcomes some of the obstacles that we see, both in terms of private landlords, but social landlords who don't want to let people who have high and complex needs because they're worried about that tenancy. So if you have a local lettings agency that can literally take those properties off people's hands and redistribute them on a pan-London basis, that I think would go a long way. It also helps to overcome some of the barriers that people face in terms of local connection.
Thanks.
So just kind of mirror, I agree with both of my colleagues. I kind of wonder whether there's some, kind of win to be had with local authorities. If there was the expectation or pressure or just request for local authorities to kind of pick this up themselves and to think, how can we implement this ourselves? And the council's housing departments, they have close relationships already with the registered providers. As Mark says, they already have teams that go out and source private rented sector accommodation. They commission locally organisations like ourselves to deliver services. They're also working very closely with colleagues at the GLA and the MHCLG to come up with local strategies to end rough sleeping. And I think if the local authority themselves were engaged in this, then we could look at the scope for tackling the issue together as opposed to competing with each other. So, there is a question about if somebody's had an experience of rough sleeping, whether they get priority access to social housing or not, whether the council's resources accessing private rent sector accommodation could be done with us so that cohort are built into those mainstream services. And really, without sounding like a broken record too much, I think that's, there has to be a kind of local, let's work together with the local stakeholders to try and implement the principles, if not the kind of purity of the model locally. And I think if that was an outcome, it'd be hugely beneficial. I'd say, though, that the councils, it shouldn't just be like the housing department of the council, it should also bring in the health and wellbeing boards so we can look at homelessness as both a health and a housing and a social care intervention collectively.
And one other issue I think is maybe around the security of tenure, because the ability for landlords just to give 2 months notice is, puts people in an incredibly precarious position. I mean, that's not just Housing First tenants, but anyone in the sector, in the private rented sector generally.
I think one difficulty that I would mention, which I'm surprised none of you have mentioned, but probably because I'm Commissioner here, is in relation to the funding of the support. So I think one of the difficulties in relation to implementing Housing First, even at a local level, has been that the support funding has been on quite a short basis. The idea of piloting Housing First, when it's supposed to be a tenancy potentially for life with support when you need it, is a kind of a confusing concept. So I think that will be one thing that I would mention is one of the potential difficulties for the moment of actually the funding in relation to it. If you are looking at doing Housing First to scale and you're looking at doing Housing First properly, you need to be looking at longer contracts for the support providers. There needs to be in place for a longer length of time to say actually this support is going to be there, so therefore you need to fund it for longer than just saying actually we're going to do a pilot for 1 year of Housing First. Great, by the time you're actually working with the client, you've gained the client's trust, that you're looking at winding down some of the projects, and we've seen that with some of the projects that have been implemented in London and nationally, whereby actually you look at it too early and you say actually we're going to do a short Housing First pilot, we're going to get people in, actually you've managed to get people into tenancy, but by the time they're accessing the support itself, the support contract is actually disappearing, so therefore you're actually setting up the individual potentially to fail in that housing because the support is no longer there. So I think that's something that needs to be looked at as well.
Okay, thanks.
Can I ask one follow-up question? Sorry, Nikki, do you want to come in?
Just ask, I don't know who know the answer to this, but those boroughs that have social lettings agencies, aren't they in a much better position to be able to secure long-term tenancies?
Potentially, and there is some work, I would say, in terms of around that kind of London-wide local lettings agency. There is work going on with London councils and with the GLA in terms of the Capital Letters project, which is looking at how to pool across temporary accommodation, because at the moment this is not, as everyone's mentioned, this is not just rough sleeping services trying to access private rented sector. This is local authorities trying to access private rented sector for individuals coming through TA. So there is work going on in relation to how to do this across temporary accommodation. We've been involved in those conversations in relation to rough sleeping. I have been a little bit and told at the moment, let's try and get the temporary accommodation and try and get the capital letters working in terms of relation to temporary accommodation and getting that agreement for local authorities, and then let's look at rough sleeping. I'm constantly trying to muscle rough sleeping into there in relation to how that works, but I think you're right. At the moment, we've got our services are fighting amongst themselves for private rented sector units. And like you say, because there are very few that meet the LHA rate, there are very few that actually meet the standard in terms of around a decent enough place for someone to move into. So therefore you end up potentially driving up the market and driving up the price of those areas. So yes, looking at it on a pan-London basis or a sub-regional basis makes sense. And I think how...
We're doing it already, and this is called a capital letting agency.
It's called Capital Letters. So Capital Letters, they're trying to develop capital letters, and London councils are leading on that piece of work in relation to trying to pool across all local authorities how to make sure you've got kind of one point of access in relation to PRS, because it's acknowledging at the moment local authorities are fighting amongst themselves for those units because actually, and like you say, playing landlords potentially...
It's not a London-wide social letting agency, it's something rather different.
This is the Capital Letters is a London, if you know, is looking at that and looking at pooling all of that together.
Yeah.
I'm not as close, if you know, I'm not that
we
close
we
to
looked
it.
at temporary accommodation, and
yes.
Capital Letters came.
Yeah,
one of the
sure
part of the
did.
team came in to talk to us
Perfect. I thought
about
Deborah did it already,
that
yes.
not that long ago. So we haven't published what they've said yet, but there may be a transcript we can look at already.
Yeah.
But it's a very, very interesting project and this was in the context of temporary accommodation, but like you say, it could be used equally well for this. I had one final question, which was about the insecurity of private rented sector tenancies. Obviously, the Assembly as a whole, as a majority, voted against Section 21, voted to support the campaign to end Section 21, which can lead to those evictions. But I'm just wondering what happens if that happens to someone who's been placed in private rented accommodation by a Housing First service. If they get a Section 21, do you kick back in and find them another one quickly? And do you take the stress out of that process?
In the rare event that has happened, then we would always support them into another form of accommodation, really. I mean, generally the relationship we have with the landlords is such that they don't randomly issue Section 21s. It will be in response to perhaps serious antisocial behaviour or what have you. But the sustainment rates are so high that actually it's not something we experience very often, and more often it's an abandonment rather than actually someone being evicted. But in the event that they were, then we would always support someone into another form of accommodation if it's felt that it's sustainable.
Thank you, that's useful to know. So yeah, moving on to the next section, we have Assembly Member Copley.
Thank you. Well, Stuart, we already sort of moved on to this a little bit in our conversation earlier because you received, I think, the only mayoral funding for a Housing First project, which was £18,500. Do you want to say any more about specifically how the money was used in the programme?
So yeah, for sure. As I understand it, the amount was double that. So it might have been that 18.5 was in one financial year.
Annual?
It was a 2-year.
So it's 37.
So it's 37 over 2 years.
I think it was 12 months, but it went over 2 financial years. So effectively, it funded a worker. That worker, as we said earlier, had a smaller caseload. Worked with the cohort that had most complex needs. Worked with people on the streets. Worked with people in those training flats that I described earlier that we already have. Worked in our shared supported housing schemes in private renter sector, and also in the council nominated social housing. So we have people who either were in those types of accommodation or were street homeless and then moved into one of those different types of accommodation, and when they were there they had this additional support. And the cohort that was selected had particularly complex needs, as I said, and the work that that person did wasn't hugely different to the work we would typically do anyway with people with that level of complex needs. They just had more time to do it. Their cohort was, their client load was much smaller. So over the year we had...
So it was additional capacity?
Additional capacity, and the kind of design of the post itself was to kind of, absolutely work with a smaller cohort. And so we recruited somebody with particular experience and background to do this type of work, and they could focus a lot more on, kind of liaising with the landlord, for example, and with local treatment providers, etc. So it was successful, and the 30 rough sleepers worked with, the targets were exceeded. 14 people accommodated, and pretty high tenancy sustainment rate, I think, and engagement in treatment, mental health treatments as well.
So is that how you were measuring the outcome? Were those the things you've listed, the sort of the indicators that you were using to measure the...
Yeah, so it's tenancy sustainment and engagement in health treatments.
Okay. And were you saying that both of those had improved as a result?
Yeah, no, undoubtedly. So
excellent.
I think it's if you have a lower staff to client ratio, you can do more work with more people with complex needs, and it's both with the individual and with the other stakeholders in their housing and their support. So undoubtedly that helps. You wouldn't design a service where one worker has a caseload of 30 or 40 clients with complex needs. You wouldn't design a service that way, but sometimes funding limitations are such that that might be a typical caseload. So if you can have a smaller caseload per worker, you can do more work and it's more effective. And I think because we were working on what was already in existence in Richmond and Wandsworth, it wasn't necessarily about finding new sources of housing. It was kind of across the different types of tenures that were available in any case. I think the other difference was that by the local authorities being stakeholders, you could get a kind of shared understanding that there's some positive risk-taking going on, and offering independent tenures to people with more complex needs, and kind of saying to so for example, the housing association, or potentially the private landlord, look, this person does have complex needs, there's more support in place, we'll be there to kind of help you and the residents if something doesn't work out, but we're going to try our best to make it work. There is something constructive about giving that message to landlords and trying to get their buy-in to the principle of it. And just to pick up on what Mark said earlier, when we as a charity like SHP recruit private landlords to work with us, we do find private landlords that have a genuine interest in the public benefit that will follow from working with the charity, which makes life an awful lot easier. Similarly with housing associations, but you do need that cooperation.
Sure. So I'm going to move us on a bit, sorry, because of time. But can I just ask finally on this bit, has the project continued after the mayoral funding has ended?
Yes and no, in as much as the kind of service itself hasn't been replaced like for like, but the provision has increased in those two areas on account of other funding that we've brought in. So for us, you know, we try and keep a kind of service provision going and scale it up as demand goes up, but different funding streams come and go. So recently we've been very successful with MHCLG funding, and that's specifically to bring rough sleeping down as much as possible, the RSI funding and the rapid rehousing pathway funding. We've had some corporate funding going into Wandsworth for outreach provision as well. So often when you get time-limited funding, it can bridge a time gap, but it can also generate evidence that you can use to secure more funding to come in. So it doesn't always work, but in this case it has worked, and over the recent past it has worked. And there is undoubtedly learning from what works that's kind of natural and organic over time. So when you have kind of smaller caseloads and you work effectively with people with very complex needs, that does kind of inform the approach that organisations take in future. So it was certainly helpful, so thank you, David, and time limited and part of a bigger picture. That's for us, our experience.
Okay, well, if I could turn to you now, David. So why was this the only Housing First project the Mayor has funded so far?
I would say, obviously, in terms of the GLA did fund, as I said, back in 2012
2015. Yeah, there
was a Housing First pilot, so I would disagree that it's the only thing. It's the only thing this Mayor's funded.
Mayor.
Yes, in my lifetime here, there has been a previous Mayor, and we did fund a thing in relation to Housing First to pilot the approach, as I said. In terms of this being the only thing funded, this was funded through our Rough Sleeping Innovation Fund. So we have our Rough Sleeping Innovation Fund that goes out and basically says to providers and to boroughs, would you like to basically come and test innovative ways of working? This was the approach we got in relation to Housing First. This is the only Housing First application that was made through in relation to that funding stream. So hence it's the one that we, have funded, and obviously we scored it against all the other applications that we got in at the same time, which includes a number of different projects. So that's the reason in terms of looking at. I think the main reason in terms of why the Mayor, has only looked at funding this project rather than anything else, is, as I mentioned at the start, in terms of the feasibility study and looking at doing this at scale. And I think all the research that's out there in terms of the Nicholas Police research, in terms of that they did with St Mungo's, is for Housing First to truly work in terms of in a large area. It needs to be done to scale. It needs to look across the entire system. So to do that, you need to be looking at it more strategically. You need to look at the additional funding. You need to look at obviously getting additional funding potentially in, as Hannah's mentioned. There is, whichever one you look at, there is going to be that short gap where you're dual funding aspects of things, and that's the reason why obviously we were very disappointed not to get the money from MHCLG in terms of for their Housing First pilots that they're doing in the other regions, because that's what they're providing. They're providing that money that goes in between to actually fund that stopgap. And if you were looking at doing that in London, you'd be looking at £84 million for the numbers that we're talking about. So it's a substantial amount of money that you're talking about in terms of around funding that would potentially be needed to cover that gap without that systematic change, to basically enable that systematic change. So it's not saying the Mayor is not supportive of Housing First. I've had quite a lot of conversations with James Murray about Housing First and about what we should be looking at doing more and more of a personalised approach. But I think it's difficult to do that at scale when we don't have actually the funding for hostels, as I mentioned. When the funding for supported accommodation is at borough level. So we need to bring boroughs along with us in terms of looking at how this model might potentially work.
You mentioned the 84 is that the money didn't get from MHCLG. Does that mean that you can't go ahead with the Pan London Housing First service?
That does not mean at this stage you can't do. Right. I'm saying if you're looking at the numbers that we've got, the 3,500 individuals that we said at the start might be, would be eligible for Housing First. The pilots that they're doing in the regions, they're targeting 1,000 people.
Yeah.
At 28 million. If you do the maths, that means that's 84 million pounds that you would potentially need for London to provide that type of, if you know what I mean, that type of service. So it doesn't mean that we can't look at it, and that's the reason why I want to do in terms of the feasibility study. But to get to that stage, we need to bring boroughs along with us. We need to bring the housing housing associations along with us. This is more of a long-term thing, and that's the reason why I want to do the feasibility study. So potentially we have that evidence base to say, actually, will this work in London? What partners do we need to bring along with us? How exactly will we get there? And then you'll be in a position to say, actually, you can hopefully try and get the relevant people in. We can do more, I think, doing more boroughs can do small scale work, if you know which they are doing, and there's some really good small scale projects that are working with specific groups in terms of Housing First. If you're looking at doing Housing First Pan London, then you need to be bringing everyone along with you.
Can I just get clarity on what happened with the pilot funding from MHCLG? So you had this pilot that you already had with the statement in the Mayor's Rough Sleeping Action Plan that we wanted to do Pan London work, and yet I think what you said earlier was MHCLG didn't even approach us about this. They just kind of decided to look at Liverpool and Manchester. Why do you think that is? Is that because they wanted to pilot it in sort of smaller but largish cities, and they just went to them and didn't think of coming to us?
Potentially, I think there is obviously if you know, housing stock is a lot more difficult in London. Housing prices are a lot more, a lot more expensive. I don't know. I'm not central. If no,
yes, they didn't discuss it and then say.
No, I don't work for. If no, obviously I don't work for MHCLG. Yes, no. If they didn't discuss it and say. If no, we had some early conversations. And I had some conversations. We shared our learning with Manchester, especially in terms of this is what we did in terms of relation to the pilots. These are the specifications we used. This is what we would suggest in terms of around doing it once they've been allocated the money. But no, we didn't. If no, it wasn't that we had any informal conversations with them before the announcement or anything like that. It came as quite a surprise to us.
Really interesting. I think maybe we might want to write to them and ask, because I mean 84 million sounds like a lot, but there are, for emergencies like the homelessness crisis that we have, money does come from central government in those kinds of quantities. So I
suggest you ask James Murray first before you ask the government.
We will have some questions for the Mayor as well about whether he'd been putting in sort of suggestions, but I think it'd be interesting to know what their reasoning was for not even getting into a conversation with London. That'd be really interesting to know. Okay, so Tom,
that's okay. So just before we get on to the Pan London service, is the Mayor considering funding any further Housing First projects, or is the focus going to be on this Pan London service?
We have got the latest round of the Rough Sleeping Innovation Fund. The rest of my team are currently looking at those bids, so I don't know what they came. The deadline was only on Friday. They were looking at bids today, yesterday and today. So I don't know whether there are any bids in there in relation to potentially into Housing First. But as such, not that I'm aware of until we've done potentially this feasibility study.
Thank you. Moving on to the Pan London Housing First service, and moving back to Mark and Stuart and Hannah, how beneficial would this be in tackling the increasing problem of chronic homelessness, and what are the key elements that are going to be needed to make the service effective? I'll start with you, Mark.
I guess there's an equal offer across all of the boroughs, which would be great. I mean, I think we are finding in those boroughs, and this is actually quite anecdotal, but I think in those boroughs where there is an offer, there tends, not purely in terms of Housing First, but in terms of service provision generally, there tends to be, it's almost like it operates as a magnet, so we're seeing an increase in the new comers to the streets there, so there's an increased pressure on the services where there is actually an offer. So in Newham and Redbridge, I think that's something that we've seen, and I think clearly this is there would be, I mean, given that fidelity to the model is an issue, I think at least a Pan London service would offer a model that shared similar attributes, and the offer would be the same. And I think clearly the boroughs are experiencing different levels of need, but I think a service like this would be able to respond to those and respond to the need as it emerges in each of those boroughs, really. So in that sense, I mean, the delivery of a model of that scale, I think, is a challenge. But I must say, we deliver Pan London service for offender services, so and we found that to be relatively effective. So I think it's definitely doable, really.
Okay. Stuart?
So as my view is somewhat different. I think if you're looking at trying to reduce rough sleeping, street homelessness, if that's the aim, that's the purpose of a Housing First Commission service, then I think it's important to kind of look locally, first of all. So you look at what's already in existence, that if you commission something else, it integrates with what's already there. The MXCLG is putting a lot of funding in at the moment on a local level. Local authorities are. And I think there's a challenge, I don't think it's an impossibility, but I think there's a challenge of linking local provision or sub-regional, like a small number of us working together, with regional provision, so that they work together. Because the solution, when you're thinking about councils, voluntary sector organisations, housing associations, and health treatment providers coming together, if you work on the basis that that's going to be part of the solution, then you need to kind of work local up, you need to work on a local scale up. So that's my view. I think there are exceptions and there are examples of where Pan-London provision works extremely well. So you do have a proportion of people that are street homeless that don't strongly identify with one area, that kind of move in and out of boroughs. You also have people that don't have a strong local connection to one particular borough. But what I do believe passionately is that once somebody who has complex needs starts to build a trusting relationship with a charity and or it could be with a health professional, that the social capital of that kind of engagement is hugely important moving forward. So consistency of support is really important in that person's recovery further on. So, you know, if somebody's doing really well and linked in with local services in Richmond, and then we say there's an accommodation available in Newham, they may very well move to Newham and engage with services there, and they may do well. But you have a much greater success if you can try and find the solution locally, build on what's already there, and keep the momentum and the consistency in the service provision. So I think the challenge is to integrate the regional and the local. I would kind of give credit to the recent commissioning approach of the MXCLG. They've very much worked with councils and their partners to say, what have you got, where are the gaps, tell us where you think you can build on, you know, what's already there to address the gaps. They've scrutinised that. And what's been very effective about that commissioning approach, I think, is that it raises it's kind of capacity builds not just the local voluntary sector organisations, but the councils as well, and the partnership between the council and their delivery partners. And together you kind of go on a journey where you have a better idea with that external scrutiny and support and funding of what a local solution looks like. So I'd advocate the kind of the balance between local and regional.
Thank you. Hannah.
I think I completely agree with Mark in the sense that one of the most important elements of having a pan-London approach to this would be ensuring consistencies across all of the boroughs, particularly in terms of the fidelity of the model. So I think when we're thinking about the evidence on this and those really high tenancy sustainment rates that we're seeing in this country but also in other countries across the world, that those pieces of research are being conducted with projects that comply with a high fidelity model. So ensuring that high fidelity approach across the whole of London and that consistency between projects would be incredibly important. The other thing that we found in Liverpool when we were looking at having a pan-local authority approach to Housing First was that some of those really important partnerships that Stuart described earlier with other public bodies, so the NHS, for example, is done much more effectively across boroughs, and having a consistent approach in terms of how you develop and work with those partnerships is much more effectively done rather than each individual borough having to negotiate some of those really, really important partnerships. I think most of the other stuff's probably being covered and you're probably running out of time, but things in terms of local connection, incredibly important on a pan-London basis. Also, at the beginning I mentioned there's around 2,300 people that would be eligible for Housing First, so that's around 70 to 80 in each borough, but you would expect those numbers to be probably a little bit lower in the outer London boroughs.
Yes, although it would be concentrated in certain boroughs.
Yeah, so in terms of providing that consistency and support to outer London boroughs, that would be well achieved through a pan-London approach, and I guess that's the way in terms of how the Mayor already delivers a lot of the pan-London services in terms of outreach, but also more specialist services for people with complex needs. That's obviously well evidenced in terms of having good results.
And David?
Yes, I'd agree with the rest of the panel. I agree with Hannah. I think one thing I would say in terms of relation to the potential feasibility study is we are trying to get MHCLG to hopefully joint fund part of this, and we'd like to, and that's what we're trying to work out in terms of officer level, and James is trying to work out as well, because we think if we can get them to buy into this as well, then hopefully that will help in terms of moving forward in terms of with it. So that's the reason why we haven't gone ahead just and done it ourselves just with crises. We want to make sure that we're bringing all the relevant partners along. I agree in terms around explicitly around the fidelity of the model and making sure there is that consistency. As you've seen, if you know what I mean, in terms of from the panel, and as you've seen in terms of START, housing first and the definition of what housing first is and those principles are very key, but it can be interpreted in a very, very different way. I mean, we took elements of a more of a housing-led approach and have included that within the clearinghouse and in our tenancy sustainment teams, but we were very clear during the course of that is not housing first, although we are taking people, as I said, directly from the streets, because they have to engage with support, and that is part of it. That is not housing first, even though there are still some people, if you know me, and some services that would label themselves as housing first if they were doing that. The reality is that's not the purity of the housing first model.
You mentioned some funding potentially for MCLG, some joint funding for this, but how do you think the Mayor can ensure the right funding is available in the long term to make sure the service is sustainable?
I think that that is a question around how exactly we show the long-term benefits of what we're proposing to do. So I think we know in terms of from the services that we run in terms of Pan London, like I said, in relation to the clearinghouse, we know we've got 97% tenancy sustainment in terms of within those units. We've built that up over a number, if you know what I mean, over a number of years. We'd be looking at doing something similar if we're looking at doing something Pan-London. We obviously would be commissioning that service out. We would commission that service out with very robust key performance indicators as we do for the current services. So there would be that aspect of it. I think the more longer term funding is a very difficult question. And as everyone's mentioned, in terms of in relation to potential savings to other areas, in relation to money coming in from other areas, that's where it's key to bring along the other partners, to bring along partners in health. You need to bring along partners. I used to be a substance misuse commissioner myself. Public health have been substantially cut in terms of local authorities, in terms of around access into those services. We need to bring in those partners along with us to ensure that that funding is there, and looking at more joint commissioning is probably the way forward.
Okay. Thank you very much. That's all from me.
Great. Does anyone else have any final? No? We're doing very well. It's fantastic. So yeah, thank you. That was
really interesting.
Very interesting. It was good to have that kind of quite open-ended discussion. We probably might have some follow-up questions. I think, Hannah, you may have promised us some data.
Yes, I can do that data.
And David will probably write to you via the Mayor to ask for some more details of what we're doing. And I think we might write to MHCLG to see if they can break their rule about waiting for the evaluation before they start funding something in London. That would be really useful of us. So yeah, can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion and agree to delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree the outputs from this discussion today?
Agreed.
Thank you. And can I ask the committee to note the summary of work completed during the 2018-19 Assembly year and the provisional schedule of meetings for the 2019-20 Assembly year, which is subject to agreement at the annual meeting of the London Assembly on the 2nd of May. And can I ask, thank you, and can I also ask the committee to delegate authority to me as current chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any further outputs relating to our work in the 2018-19 Assembly year and arrangements for any site visits, informal meetings or engagement activities before the next formal meeting of the committee.
Agreed.
Thank you very much. My last meeting as chair, it's been a joy. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Sean.
Thank you, Sean. And subject to confirmation of the London Assembly's calendar, the next meeting of the Housing Committee is scheduled for the 8th of May at 2 p.m. So I will see you all there.
Thank you.
Thank
you very much.
Oh, sorry, and just to say, I don't have any urgent business. Thank you. Got the last bit of my last agenda.
GLA, Committee Room